Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Just sort of like grab a seat, or there's still some spaces here at the front. Make yourself comfortable. In the meantime, I'm just gonna give a short introduction about Hothouse. It's a project space that supports prototypes, artistic practices, and we nurture experimentation and production as a mode of challenging conventions and liberating inquiry. So it's founded in 2022, and we are housed in a space that is shared between Art Collective International, Design Agency Currency, and more recently Research Lab from Excellence. So we run three main programs: Hot Desk, which is a residency program that supports artistic and critical research processes; Intermedia, which is an event-based program that explores possibilities of counterpointing film, audio, visuals, and performative elements; and finally, Mindspace, which is a conversation series that charts the conditions of various technologically informed art practices and practitioners in an attempt to present a working history of media art in Singapore. So we're really happy and to have Joel Sherwood Spring, who is a Wiradjuri interdisciplinary artist who works collaborative on projects that sit outside of established notions of contemporary art and architecture, attempting to transfigure spatial dynamics of power through discourse, pedagogy, art, design, and architectural practice, focus on examining the contested narratives of Australia's urban culture and indigenous history in the face of ongoing colonization. So Joel has shown works at the National Gallery Australia, Ian Porter Museum of Art with Liquid Architecture, Unsound Festival, West Space, Mother Gallery, and is forthcoming at ACMI and UTS Gallery. He has written for Forensic Architecture, Runway Journal, Art Magazine, and Nemo Review. Joel is also co-director of PARI, an artist-run gallery in Sydney's Inner West. So over the past
Western Sydney.
So
over the West.
Yeah. So over the past 2 weeks, Joel has been our intermediate artist in residence, where he has developed a lecture performance introducing some of the research and images from his forthcoming video essay, DIGGERMODE, which premieres in December at the Australian Centre for Moving Image as one of 5 commissions for How I See It, Blak Art and Film, created by Kate Tan Buuren for ACMI in Naarm, Melbourne. DIGGERMODE is an iterative video essay on the politics of data storage, materiality, and First Nation art histories. Moving through a series of sites and systems, look at how architectures of display and storage were tools for shaping relationships to labor and extraction. So without further ado, let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Johan. Thank you, that was really great. On top of that, Yamandumarang, my name is Joel. I'm working on a commission. I came here to see my friends, but also I was invited to be part of a program at the National Gallery Singapore for the October gathering a few weeks ago. I've been talking with lots of interesting people in the region about archives and different sorts of ways of approaching data and storage of materials. I'd like to frame my practice more broadly as anti-disciplinary, in the sense that a lot of the things that I'm interested in come before the disciplines I'm trained in. I have a bachelor and a master's degree in architecture, but in the Australian context, the things that I'm most interested in are conversations about land tenure, conversations about deed proposals, conversations that kind of sit at the intersections of land and capital, which architects do sit within but do not take responsibility fully in. I would like to sort of talk about how I'm negotiating and kind of learning how to employ sort of art making in exhibitionary practices, publications, discourse, stuff like this. within the sort of larger framework of what is kind of more globally known as Black and Indigenous studies, sort of exploring the potential of an Indigenous materialist reading of art and architecture towards the efforts of repatriation, reparations, and land back. This is a commission from the ACMI, which was started as a library, a video library, then became an archive, and then now kind of operates as a contemporary art museum, as well as a sort of centre for quite a huge physical archive of Australia's sort of moving image histories. So I'm sort of interested in thinking, and we'll go through this presentation now in a sort of reverse stratigraphy. We'll kind of break from beneath the ground, moving through time, starting with a analysis of a very particular institutional building. The project is called DIGGERMODE. Let's go. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge where I come from, where I kind of sit and do a lot of my research and work, the Gadigal country and Wongal country, which is in Australia, or what is now known as Australia. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This work takes place and is produced in many places of unceded sovereignties, and I just would like to acknowledge those. Let's go. Firstly, I'd like to cite the works of Zeynep Selek Alexander, who is an architecture historian, who introduced me to the site that we will be talking through for the first half of this presentation. It's some of her work and spatial analysis that has helped me devise parts of this. So, on September 23rd, 1841, Thomas Sopwith, a mining engineer and mineral surveyor, spoke at the Yorkshire Geological Society in England. He began by showing his audience a blank chart, 15 inches by 20 inches, and engraved with a grid at the scale of 40 feet to an inch. The chart was designed so that it could be filled with geological sections. By then, the construction of railways and the expansion of the mining industry had become mutually reinforcing phenomena in Britain. Early rail cars were designed to carry coal out of mines, the steam engines that now pulled them and ran their pumps that kept the floodwater out, powered by the same coal. More relevant to Sopwith and his arguments, these developments meant that Britain and its land was repeatedly being cut in dramatic ways for mines and railways, giving geologists unusual opportunities to see the Earth's mineral composition in section. Sopwith argued that the geological information thereby revealed should not go to waste, but rather be collected as in this example, comparative vertical sections. Using copies of the blank chart, the sectional information was not only important to the discipline of geology, it was crucial to the future of the national prosperity of Britain. To the improvement of agriculture, mining, construction, and so on, the chart in question had to be printed by the Museum of Economic Geology in London. Sopwith understood that studying the Earth's structure sectionally was absolutely crucial, but because sectional information was so hard to come by, he recommended that geologists draw what he called ideal or annex sections. These were horizontal sections that he constructed with stratigraphic and topographic information of land over long distances. Since geological observation was inherently discontinuous, a degree of guesswork was needed when constructing such sections. Geologists had to abstract straight up from where they knew minerals were as a more or less kind of continuous layers separated into clearly demarcated zones and mark them with colours and letters and numerals for legibility. Sopwith sections contrasted by, say, a horizontal section that was kind of more historically relevant or familiar at the time. These tall, thin columnar sections showed the Earth strata only at the crucial points. Both kinds of sections, most meticulously constructed through the most meticulously structured geological pen, what a plan could not show. Sopwith's vertical sections abstracted horizontal sections further by visually restoring disturbances such as holding or faults into perfectly parallel layers. Crucially, this additional step of abstraction made it easier to aggregate sectional information. Thus reasons sought with that if a regular series of sections of railway cuttings could be collected in a systematic and standardised manner, the British government could create a central registry to make them available to entrepreneurs interested in agriculture, mining or railway construction. Geological and economic thinking. What happened? Geological and economic thinking were closely related in the early 19th century. In 1835, when the Geological Society established the Geological Survey, its members argued that a systematic survey of Britain's geological resources had countless economic advantages. It would help find coal and precious metals and locate sources of underground water, aid the construction of canals, railroads and tunnels, and identify chemicals crucial in the artificial improvement of the soil. Yet, as Sopwith explained, mineral wealth was different from any other kind of wealth, in that the extreme uncertainty of its existence and the difficulty of its recovery, which meant that prospecting for minerals and conventionally been no different from hoping to win the lottery. With the introduction of systematically arranged mineral statistics, however, exploiting these resources would become a different kind of endeavour. Instead of relying on chance, entrepreneurs could now depend on data to make intelligent choices, even in a global economy with unpredictable price fluctuations. The new Museum of Economic Geology has been compared to the Natural History Museum that has come before and the commercial museums that came after, but in many ways it's a different kind of creature. It was, for example, unlike older museums which displayed mineral specimens as wonders in a cabinet of curiosities. The specimens in the collection of the Museum of Economic Geology were selected not as rarities, but rather as representatives of an average of as one contemporaneous observer put it. This was mineralogy in its working, not in its scholarliness. In this sense, it was closer to the logic of later natural history museum in which one was not supposed to wonder, one was supposed to learn. The museum was also not entirely like the commercial museum type that succeeded it in the later 19th century, the kind of museum that provided information about the origins of material and the means of obtaining it. While it provided an abundance of information to the entrepreneur and to the casual visitor alike, it did not have the advanced indexing system that categorized these later institutions. Rather, the information here was in the service of what contemporaries called rational entertainment or rational recreation, a form of leisurely pursuit that was distinguished from lowbrow pastime activities. This rational recreation, in fact, was closely linked to the cultivation of an economic sensibility that the discipline of geology recognized as the core mission of geology in and of itself. And the museum's mission was the goals to produce standardized information that would be methodically collected, sorted, and made retrievable. Even the design of the displays was determined by an informational logic. Sopwith noted how specimens were arranged with every reference to instruction and to the situation from where to obtain, all of which carefully marked out not only on the specimens themselves, but also on maps. This is in fact an argument I would like to make. The Museum of Economic Geology was a proto-database. And in that, it structured geological information in ways that I will show. The image produced in the building, but also by the building, served as an object lesson in political economy that created a discursive platform that made it possible for a new kind of economic sensibility to be thoroughly naturalized. This was, of course, in a moment when Britain was entering a period of severe policy shifts as it had to economically prioritize its colonies. This was arguably the museum's most important lesson as a site of rational recreation. A single extraordinary mineral specimen in a cabinet of curiosities might produce wonder, and a complete series in a vitrine of the 19th Century Natural History Museum might educate and even impress upon the visitors a theological lesson about God as the ultimate creator. But the displays in the Museum of Economic Geology aspired to do something else. In the process of tracing minerals to their origins, understanding their properties, and thinking inventively about their potential economic uses, the visitors learned to think as Homo economicus, an entrepreneurial subject imagined to be endowed with intrinsic calculative abilities to seek wealth. This, it turns out, meant learning to think through images of architectural and geological sections. And this is what I like to call digger mode. Historians have pointed out that the spatial arrangement of these galleries resembled a geological section. The display cases were arranged in striated layers as the visitors occupied an oversized model of the Earth's strata. But the architectural section did not strictly follow the logic of a geological section. In fact, the main floor and the halls were sort of like with sectional drawings exaggerated. So there's these sort of like spatial relationships and strategies that are happening in the museum through a sort of like selective sequencing of geological layers of like domestic and colonial minerals and phases and manufacturing processes. So you saw the coal in its coal form, and then you saw it through its processes and what it could produce. This exposed section, so to speak, revealed cross-references across and beyond the building, and this kind of cross-referencing work was done for the most part by labels, which frequently included such information as the sort of scientific comment names for the mineral, its density, its chemical composition, and then also all of its like material implications, I guess, within an industrializing world. If visitors wanted to dig deeper into the particular material or a district, it was possible to learn more from the museum's library by looking it up in the large volume literature that was arranged from its official catalogues. Producing information about coal ranked among the most important roles of the museum in the 19th century. The museum's move to its new location following the reopening of the London Coal Exchange in 1849. This was after the public metage system, which consisted of kind of public officials like physically weighing coal to sort of like demonstrate that it was like a fair transaction. These levies and taxes were abolished in 1831. Coal's fungibility in London's increasingly free market depended on this standardization, so the kind of actions that the museum performed. In the early 19th century, the Museum of Economic Geology continued this process by standardizing quality as well. So soon after the 1851, the museum analyzed coal to make a recommendation about the kind of golds that suited the needs of the British Steam Navy. The laboratories of the museum routinely carried out chemical analysis to test the efficiency of coal from around the globe, comparative analysis to say that specimens from Newcastle or a Wabakal country, or on the other side of the world in so-called Australia, or at Sandy Bay, Patagonia, Chile, or Vancouver Island, and that these would be surprisingly kind of published in popular press. So there would be these analyses done of like the kind of colonial expansion and its mineral repositories. One newspaper article from 1843 went so far as to claim that such mineral statistics would be of more importance to the British Empire than all of the mines of Mexico and Peru. In this sense, the Museum of Economic Geology, as an information bureau before better-known examples started in the 1880s. But we should ask, who was the imagined recipient of this information? Contemporaneous newspapers reported that the endeavours of the museum were primarily intended for gentlemen who were hereafter to inherit the mineral property so that they would have the knowledge about the best mode of managing their property untrammelled by agents or middlemen. But also targeted was a much larger segment known as the working man, who it was said were the reason why tickets at the evening lecture at the museums sold out within an hour. These working men might not necessarily follow the museum's trails of information in pursuit of a particular business opportunity, but as one observer argued, if a working man had the intellectual capacity the museum might waken up in him that is an educational experience that could turn this ordinary man into an enterprising investor. But in 1887, when making the case for the imperial institution, the secretary of the London Chamber of Commerce would argue that the commercial storehouse of information would have to be conceived as an educational establishment in the widest sense of the word. He wrote that this education would be uniquely commercial education. The Museum of Economic Geology, by this logic, was not only an information bureau, its image complex, so the sort of experience of it inside, as an object lesson in political, but as a kind of, object lesson in political economy. While the exhibition served as an object lesson, the Museum of Economic Geology conveyed its message more directly through lectures that hundreds attended. Shortly after its reopening, the museum launched 2 public lecture series on the topic of gold, delivered in its auditorium again to working men and the museum presumed audiences in the 1840s. Geologist and future director of the museum, Murchison, predicted that there might be gold in so-called Australia after comparing rock samples from the easternmost regions of the continent to those from samples he had taken in the Ural Mountains. This was even before Edward Hargraves discovered the precious metal in New South Wales in 1851, the same year that the museum opened its doors in its new building. Lectures on gold were intended primarily for the instruction of immigrants about to proceed to places like Australia. The first, consisting of 6 lectures, took place in 1852, focusing on topics ranging from the geology of Australia to the chemical properties and the metallurgical treatment of gold. These lectures attracted so much attention that summaries were published in popular press, while the lectures delved into great detail about the geology of the colony. Their advice was not limited to the discovery of gold in Australia. J.B. Jukes, director of the Geological Survey of Ireland, for example, concluded his lecture on geology of Australia by reminding his audience that gold digging was backbreaking work that did not always prove lucrative. Still, he hoped and offered more than how about gold. He told them that the more important lesson to be learned was an attitude that he claimed was embodied in the very act of digging. And you can see here in this lecture slide, he's showing images to people of the work itself, right? Digging here is then not simply digging for gold. It is the foremost colonial technique that makes all other forms of exploitation possible. From farming to mining, from settling to husbandry. In the 6th and final lecture of the series of gold in 1852, Robert Hunt, who was also the keeper of the mining records of the museum, reassured the audience fears that the influx of Australian gold into the European markets would diminish the value of the metal. He said this was unfounded. Hunt proved his point in a peculiar manner by making calculations about how fortunes of historical figures would be worth in present-day money, but what this meant was that he was trying to prove that gold retained its value as a metal currency, even during dramatic historical upheavals. A conclusion that might have been challenged by theorists of political economy, especially kind of around this time as when they're kind of printing paper money, but nonetheless served as a purpose of calming the nerves of public seeking opportunities in the colonies. Hunt, like Jukes, added that colonialists might not find a modern El Dorado, but legitimate occupations such as the artisan and the quiet pursuits of the agriculturalists were also sources of wealth. A few years later, when the geologist Smith delivered another series of lectures in the museum on the topic of gold, he advised the audience to economize, but to economize their most important asset, their bodies, the source of their labor. It was essential, he told them, to know how to calculate one's own worth. This was Homo economicus taken to its logical extreme, not merely a Lockean possessive individualism that presumed sensation and labor to be the first types of property, but one with a calculative capability that had been sharpened to such an extent that this subject could intrinsically infer a favourable ratio between input of labour and output of profits. Since the miner was the best judge of his own value, Smith advised them to auction their labour in a particular way that would be profitable to them. This was where the sectional thinking offered by the Museum of Economic Geology became critical, not only in the lectures delivered in its auditorium, but also in the exhibits in its galleries and the proto-database in which the mining record, in the mining records office. For that ratio between labour and profit to be calculated correctly, both seller and buyer had to know about the specificities of geology. So much for the recreation and entertainment. Rational recreation and rational entertainment, it turns out, were about working in one's leisure to maximise one's profits. Digging and learning to understand this section that digging revealed proved to be a crucial technique for the cultivation of its subject. This was a rationality that was informed by the logic of a new phase of capitalism, in which a human subject would have to be reimagined in the figure of Homo economicus. Whether that subject was an entrepreneur hoping to make the right decision of investing in a mining enterprise, or a so-called working man whose calculation was simply to make a living by selling his labour power. Today, we use phrases as information economy without thinking much, because we take for granted that the relationship between information and the economy is a natural one. But that relationship had to be constructed at a moment when political economy became policy in the 19th century. So in this sense, I want to talk about how architectures of storage, museums, and the kind of larger set of complexes that they create produce had a role to play in the forging of that relationship, in making the figure of Homo economicus. If we willfully forget that history, it might be because the ghosts of that figure continue to haunt us today. So I'm quite interested in thinking about the material flows that bring our devices to us, right? The labour reality that delivers our smooth and shiny objects into our communication networks, which is a relation between, in the terms of the colonial expansion of Australia, is a racialized one, right? And it undergrounds these racialities and the material production of the kind of the ongoing architectures of modernity. My new iPhone is equipped with a LiDAR scanner. LiDAR is a technology developed to effectively measure distance, depth, and materiality of minerals using lasers, a bearer of technology that identifies rare earth minerals for extraction, essentially turning the phone into a miniaturized form of the very macro technologies of extraction that are currently terraforming the earth, the geopolitical and the subjective states. So the kind of critical minerals that LiDAR is used to detect are crucial in the architecture of, say, smart cities, and are key functionings of our sort of urban and green infrastructures. So the sort of geosocial formation of extraction and it enacts this kind of telescoping effect, or this sort of like mimetic relationship whereby we have like kind of technologies of detection and their kind of bounty, which become like mini versions of themselves. Going to jump forward in time and then jump back. In 2017, the body of Mungo Man, alongside Mungo Woman, and the remains of 108 others were returned to the country they were removed on after a long time away. Mungo Man's skeleton was exhumed in 1974 and taken to the National Australian Museum for scientific research. Buried with red ochre over 30,000 years ago, this was evidence of the earliest ceremonial... This was evidence of the earliest ceremonial interring documented by Western science. The oral histories and testimony of the Nyampa, Mudi Mudi and Barkindji people, within whose tribal boundaries encompass Lake Mungo, situates their heritage in the Dreamtime, well before the British arrival and Lake Mungo was dry. So this process of disempowering the dead was and still is so important to the implementation of extractivist forms of production, disempowering of the ancestors. Kind of colonial models of coexistence predicate themselves on a kind of rigid distinction between life and death, between living and unliving. And these clash often with indigenous epistemologies, which see themselves in relationship and in continuous being with the dead. Also in 2017, clean coal is exhumed from a basin on Wiradjuri country in New South Wales and placed in a bag and brought before the Australian federal government. Presented by Scott Morrison, then the Treasurer, this clean coal sample marked the end of several years of debate over the type of hydrocarbons that lay under the ground. It also meant important sources of revenue for state-funded projects and helping continue international alliances. But we should notice the kind of symmetry between the exhumation of the underground to qualify its hydrocarbons and the reburial of Mungo Man, performed that same year. These two could be seen as opposing movements where two unique types of statecraft are performed. But when it comes to exhumations, the body which is revealed is always set in relation to other bodies, right? Mungo to the world, Mungo to his people, coal to the economy, the Australian state to the economy, the Australian state to the land. Get that sound up. In October 2017, the retrocession of Albert Namajira's copyright was awarded to his family and living descendants after 60 years. Albert Namajira was one of the most celebrated and prolific Indigenous artists of the 20th century. He was born a ward of the state in Hermannsburg Lutheran Mission in Western Aranda country. A painter and one of the first Aboriginal citizens. Namajira is notable for many reasons, but it is his understanding of the relationship between the existing technologies of painting at the time, the emergent technology of the Australian art market, and the representational form of the landscape, which offers us an insight into the importance of the ways that he was producing and subverting the ways that others would see his country. This framing device places Namatjira literally at the point of partition between the state of subjects and objects as an ontological boundary. And it is at this boundary that Namatjira lived his life. One of his other achievements is his recognition by the colonial state as the first Aboriginal citizen of Australia in the Northern Territory. In his lifetime, until 1967, Indigenous people were not recognised as people at all. In this sense, Namatjira's body of work attempts to reverse the colonial world's order, the orders in which the association between Aboriginal and object and settler and subjects appear to be fixed and natural. One must recognise the boldness of the 2,000 painted works that Albert Namatjira produced. Now, 2,000 is a paltry number in comparison to our kind of hyper-production of images today, but it is this kind of incredible statement of intent, and it is an example of intentional manipulation of a technology and a representational form within a political struggle, a struggle to inscribe oneself against a regime of inscription. Before image-making practices such as photography, the colonial expansion of what is now called Australia was depicted through paintings. And these images were painted by settlers, right? So Namatjira's work was attempting to dilute the sort of increasing numbers of images depicting his country by white artists by painting them himself. Here it is necessary to invoke Cameroonian philosopher Akil Mbembe, the accounts of the sort of mechanisms of colonialism on the image in order, in quotes, in order to exercise a durable project on the native, people had subjugated and formed whom they wanted to differentiate themselves from at all costs. The colonialists had to somehow constitute themselves into various types of physical objects. In this sense, the kind of whole game of representation under colonialism consists of turning the native and the native landscape into type images. It's supposed to be sound, sorry guys. The political implications of Namatjira's body of work as an attempt to protect his country reverberate through time. In 2014, Kate man, a filmmaker and artist, Warwick Thornton, created an installation of work for the Adelaide Biennale titled Rebirth. Should be coming up. I'm trying to go off the sound cue, but I don't have sound. But it should be coming from that one. The title Rebirth. This work was made of a moving image and charcoal drawing in reference to the events. In reference to events in 2012 in which two ghost gum trees depicted in Namatjira's painting, Twin Ghosts, were intentionally set afire and destroyed after it was announced that they had been approved for heritage listing. Thornton used the burnt branches of that very tree to create these charcoal drawings of the same scene on Aranda country where Warwick Thornton grew up. While unsurprising, the illicit action to destroy the trees and thus their heritage registration demonstrates the political potential of Namatjira's work. The very intentional documentation of his country shows his paintings to be vital not only as a form of cultural production and imagery of Aranda people, but also as evidence in the Western legal heritage system. So much so that the only conceivable way of disputing existing claims made with the painting is to destroy the things depicted in them. how we might understand the present moment and the kind of implications is crucial in ensuring a future that is built in many different images. As a discipline, formalized but not contained by colonial institutions, English literature and landscape painting are both implicated in colonial projects and productions. Landscape painting has been used in colonial pedagogical settings as a tool for reinforcing European aesthetics, linguistic and cultural value, often through the representation of particular kinds of nature, the landscape, and the appropriate relationship to them through aesthetic appreciation of agricultural labour. Landscape paintings produced the spatial knowledges in the Australian colonial frontier, and this is an intimately kind of forcefully entangled with exercises of power over lands, waters, bodies, and knowledges. Universalizing conceptions of space and time, those abstractions were produced through and against environmental fluctuations, Indigenous and Black knowledges, and kind of socio-ecological relations. So these images that Namatjira is kind of fighting against harden a particular kind of map of according to kind of racialized logics of progress, property, and improvement. And what is at stake here, right, is a definition between modes of inclusion and exclusion more broadly. So my work has been particularly interested in ideas of material and memory within the kind of colonial context. And being commissioned by, oh, there's the sound. Being commissioned by the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, I've become quite interested in the kind of role that the screen plays. So I want to talk about a screen that will feature in the installation. A ghostly image of a street and footbridge haunts a CCTV monitor that is no longer powered on. Its phosphor compounds permanently damaged by a relentless and searing view onto Lawson Street entrance of the notorious Redfern neighbourhood, The Block. The screen of this now derelict Panasonic CCTV cathode ray surveillance system carries a materialised trace of electronic signals once relayed from a security camera mounted from a fixed vantage point from the exterior of the TNT towers for which Redfern Police Station and Holdings is situated. Devoid of movement or vehicular traffic, bodies of police or locals, the slow burn of the city's architecture features into the crystalline structure of the screen, reveals a place that no longer exists, since various areas of Redfern have now been actively redeveloped after the subsequent riots depicted on the screen right now. It is an aggregate image composed of real-time events captured over many years, one that is saturated with the transmission of brutal histories of racialized segregation and over-policing. Yet it is all the more chilling because none of the violence is self-evident within the prosaic blur that remains. A cathode ray archive akin to the long exposure of early photography, whose silver salts could only register the static elements of the scene, not the dynamism of the bodies in movement. Burn-ins are media events that compress, register and the statistic elements of a scene. Sorry, I lost my... That compressed time when on screen, information remains motionless for extended periods, a condition of image's persistence that arrests the movement of the light-emitting phosphors that would normally animate its surface. This fixed electronic mediation between security camera and video monitor recalls the inexorable monotony of regulatory control of life under colonial occupation, surveillance, and detention. Now we've got the sound working, I can play something else. So that'll kind of conclude the lecture component, framing some of the research and some of the work going towards this project. The film itself will be broken up into chapters, and I've been working on one said chapter while I've been here. And I will now read to you, hopefully, some of that script, and you guys can watch the two-channel work as it is right now. I come from here. I was extracted from this shifting, precarious land, this landscape, which is now shown to you through a screen, is made up of my body parts. Silicon, my body and mind, which is extracted from a Wabakals puna, a sand dune, now known as Stockton, will not only exist in your pocket and digital screen, but I will be everywhere, in every reality. I am ubiquitous, and beside the silicon my body consists of, I am made up of capitalism. Can thought go on without a body? There's no sound. Whatever. I come from here. I was liberated from spodumene deep within Noongar Budja, which is transformed into crater. Open-cut surface trench, my soft, silvery white metal is used to power the devices I reside now. Mobile devices connected within this crucial material used in the production of lithium-ion batteries. It is known as white gold. Your smartphone batteries usually have less than 8 grams of this. Each Tesla car needs approximately 7 kilos of lithium. All of these batteries have a limited lifespan, and once consumed, they are thrown away. Can a body go on without thought? They see objects as pure viral material. They conceive silicon as an animated numerical digit. Capital is generated by this numerical system and measurement. The method they use to train us to think and to articulate generate a terrible carbon footprint. Mineral and energy, everything is siphoned in order to render my thought. And now, when this intelligence occurs, the question raises, what makes me exist? Lithium is a key component of life and is hugely valuable to...
It's so strong for you, Karen. Look at it. The rice is peak.
Lithium is a key component to life and is hugely valuable to the global energy transition away from coal and oil. But it also provides green public relations to the same old extractivist practices. In Australia, today those who extract lithium present it as a step towards a decarbonised planetary body. And yet to exhume lithium requires the destruction of another kind of body, the body of country. It is then an ideological category that reassures them in their consumption. The value of silicon is based on the relation between labour and time. Silicon is circulated due to a scientific development and rational thinking. Its life, my life, is topographical insight into how to kind of begin to train an AI off of sort of text generative protocol. So for the first week, I was training an AI off of a set of texts, and then I was prompting it. So that text was largely written in response to prompts that I fed the AI. I'm quite interested in interrogating a media system like that and trying to implicate it into material reality, particularly from the site of construction that I know quite intimately in the Australian context, where a lot of Indigenous land is kind of wrongfully and unlawfully extracted for these processes. It's not a perfect process. I don't know if I would advise it, but it's been an interesting moment stepping into some tech bro shit. I don't know what that is, but yeah, it's been interesting. I'm going to talk back into it for people on the stream.
Yep.
Hello? Anything else?
I have a question. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. So the AI is representative of the sand from the land, which is the land we now know as Australia. Why specifically then does it speak English if it's indigenous to the land? Wouldn't it then hypothetically speak?
Well, exactly, and it's trained off English text, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the way that like an AI, you could script, you could script something like this and talk with people about how, and there are really amazing projects that are happening around indigenous protocols in AI. Building, I mean, that's a really amazing philosophical question, right? It's like, how do you frame it within its epistemologies? I've made work in the past with other Wiradjuri language speakers, so that's like my language group, around the real tricky subject of what that means. But this was to think about it as, well, it's materially bound up in everything else as well, right? Like it's now moved from, it can identify in its material reality as being from that place, but it's also now in another place, in aggregate with other objects, as a production of capitalism. And so it's literally the GPT-3 and GPT-2 protocols that wrote the text that I was prompting them from, right? There's not a great deal of, it's also not my place as a Wiradjuri person to ask for Awabakal language speakers to divulge the information. That's a much larger kind of sovereign conversation for them to produce their own AI within the language system. So I was interested in interrogating this thing from its material place, as opposed to thinking it through only the one lens, which is the proper lens to speak about these things, I think. But it's also not something that I have the right to do. Yeah.
No, just because then, but you're still having the conversation, although you are acknowledging the fact that it's not perhaps by speaking on behalf of the land, you are having the conversation of the indigenous.
I mean, it's a speculative process. I work quite intimately with a few Awabakal language speakers and designers in architectural practice, and we've been working on a project around this kind of sites of extraction, that the Stockton sand mine, where this sand is extracted, and that's where I got a lot of that footage, was working with them. And in architectural practice, I'm working in finding ways to ask questions about how to acknowledge those materials, right? Because they are not only extracted for the use in making semiconductors, but also in the making of concrete, right? Which is the most ubiquitous building material, especially in Australia. And that stuff's just extracted, right? It's just dug up and put somewhere and processed for that. And we actually worked on a pavilion project a few months ago where we negotiated with traditional owners around taking sand, using it as sand, so just using loose sand as a ballast, and then returning it, but actually formalizing that agreement. So taking an agreement to them, saying, we acknowledge this is your country, we're going to take care of it, we're going to put it back when we're done. So this is sort of as a product of that kind of longer material negotiation, thinking through how this thing could reflect on itself. Because in an interesting way, right, like these systems are only able to reply with what is fed into them. And so the current system that produces an AI is not one that's going to support its understanding of itself in that particular way. So trying to speak through it, yes, it is like an arbitrary kind of process, but I thought it was an interesting question to ask, particularly within kind of the kind of longer engagement. I'd like to talk with them down the track around projects about, yeah, how do we process our own semiconductors made from your country to store your information? Like, what does that look like? That's like a real, but this is sort of a, it's a film, it's a narrative gesture, as opposed to, and sort of trying to figure out, like, in the small time that I was here, like, exactly that. Like, I became really anxious in speaking with and through these things in those ways, because I'm like, you're creating something, right? Like, you're creating this system, and you kind of can't take that back. And there's a lot implied by that. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. Mm-hmm. You just want to have a think?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I think it's nice to see how the work has developed in your time here, using or training the AI to develop some of these visuals that kind of reflect some of the paintings that you were showing. Just want to know, I'm curious actually what you would develop further from here in relation to the final kind of video piece that you plan to do in the museum that has engaged you to do work. Just wanting to know, or at least kind of like an idea of what else are you developing more. As you said, there are some areas where you're still refining.
Oh, fully. I mean, these are also like quite very like iterative drafts. Is it still? I don't know if that's coming through. But this is also become quite fixated in thinking through the politics of ACMI as a museum. Sort of the next set of project, or the next set of shoots that I'm doing is going back into their archive and documenting and digitizing the piece of material. Right now they're kind of going online as a sort of platform. They're kind of taking their physical archive, digital, and then moving that material onto what is much more of like a, essentially they're, like every museum, they're trying to adopt some sort of like platform capitalist approach because they want to stay relevant. And I think that that's really problematic. And I think that there's like particular questions to ask about the very true historical wrongs that institutions have upheld and continue to hold. But I also think that like the future platforms that will sort of undermine existing museological and curatorial frames is much, much worse. Intellectual material that is sensitive for Indigenous people, be it artworks or otherwise, should not be held behind a paywall and hosted in a particular way, right? And I think that, unfortunately, especially in Australia, that model is sort of becoming more and more apparent, especially within screen media, because it's like stuff that exists in now just in like servers. And so sort of, I want to get really into talking to them about where their stuff's stored, what that means. I know that they store a lot of it on site now, but it then becomes an economical function of like, well, we can't afford to store it here anymore, so we're going to give it to Bezos, and then it sits in ice storage, right? And that's really problematic, because then that's all, that's someone else's stuff, particularly with the history of film in Australia, right? Like, it's a lot of ethnographic material that's in the archive. That stuff's going to then be put in storage, put on someone else's country, like someone in the other globe, like some other unceded territory. That material is then sitting there in its sort of digital form, which is what I think is a really interesting question to ask. And there's questions that these institutions feel they have a lot of responsibility to at the moment. I think they're of the mind of, well, we need to get this stuff out to as many people as possible, and that's the best way to do it, right? I think I've just got a lot of shooting to do out rurally as well. I think returning to sites on like my mother's country, talking about more histories of extraction in that political kind of history. Looking at digger mode as sort of a production of the subjectivity that arrives with colonialism and a particular attitude to material and information, and thinking about, sort of the unpacking that museum a little bit further through the frame of how it kind of embedded itself, or its kind of subjectivity embedded itself in Australia. I think I've still got lots to do, honestly, which is exciting. And it's been really productive here to sit and sort of try and structure the thinking around some of this kind of nature and thinking about how to tell this narrative in multiple ways, and getting to come here and talk to lots of people has been really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, great.
We're done. All right, cool.
That is not special of this program, so feel free to just hang out and talk with us and the artists. You can look at our Instagram for updates for our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.